Last but not least, in this learning module, I want to say a few words about linguistic modernization. Now, you may be saying to yourself, wait, didn't we just do that? Didn't we just cover all the simplifications and change in the orthography? Yeah, we did. But you know what that is? That's all the writing system. What I want to talk about now is the grammar, because we really didn't talk about that at all. There was a huge change between classical Japanese and modern Japanese. So what is classical Japanese? Classical Japanese, usually it's referred to as bungo, is grammatically very different from colloquial or modern Japanese, which we refer to as kogo or the vernacular. Okay, the ko means kuchi, the way that language is spoken. There are different verbal and adjectival inflections in classical Japanese, which is why if you just pick up a text, the Tale of Genji or something like that, it really seems like a foreign language. And when we're talking about classical Japanese, although it continues through the centuries all the way up into the modern era, I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute, when we learn classical Japanese, we're really looking at a language that was written and spoken 1,000 years ago. And when you think about any language, English, for example, English 1,000 years ago was complicated for us now to look at, and really quite a different language altogether. We have to be trained to read that stuff. And same thing with classical Japanese. You can't just pick it up if you're a native speaker and understand it without being trained. Consequently, most Japanese students, junior and senior high school students, have to take classical Japanese at school, and most of them retain it for about 3 minutes. They take a test, they forget it, and it's just gone. But if you look at the traditional curriculum for middle school and high school students, you'll see it. It's there. Okay, so let me say a little bit more about classical and where that fits into the big picture. Classical Japanese was the way we think people spoke way back when, 1,000 years ago. And that was the standard form that was used for writing until fairly recently. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, writers began to change their writing to reflect spoken Japanese. So think of it this way. For centuries, people were writing using the same sort of grammatical paradigms, and I really do mean to use that word paradigm, as you'll see later on in this lesson. But as that happened, the way that people spoke started to diverge from the way that they were writing. And so eventually you find yourself in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in this awkward situation in which people wrote in a significantly different manner than the way they spoke. This did not really lend itself to high literacy rates and things like that. It had become a weird artificial schism between the written and the spoken language. And so in the Meiji period, there was a movement, unofficial, this is not a government thing. It was called the Genbun Ichi movement, and that Genbun Ichi means bringing together the spoken and the written. Many people felt that that schism, that huge gap, needed to be filled. And it could be fixed or filled by uniting the spoken and the written word. But that was a big, difficult hurdle to get over. It wasn't an easy thing to do. There were many different suggestions on how it should be done, and there were a number of conundra, I think that's the plural of conundrum, about how it should be accomplished. To make a very complicated long story short, although if you're looking for a thesis topic, I think the study of the Genbun Ichi movement is kind of a cool one. By 1920 or so, most fiction writers had chosen the vernacular over classical. But official documents, government documents and things like that, if you pick up something that was written prior to 1945, it will still be in classical grammar. Another argument for learning a little bit about classical. Typically in the United States, classical Japanese is only taught at the graduate level. Once in a while here at Albany, we do teach it to undergraduates. But I think there's a good argument for studying it. Now, I also want to say that these numbers like 1920 are ballpark ideas. What typically happened in the world of literature was that a writer whose lifespan covered the late Meiji period and into the Taisho, a typical writer would make a decision, a sort of almost like a career decision at some point in that person's career to switch over. And curiously, once that switch was made, that person almost never, I can't think of an example even, of somebody who reverted back to classical. So that decision was a big decision to make, but it was an individual one. It wasn't as if one day all the writers in Japan woke up and said, from this point forward, we're going to be writing in the vernacular. What I also find really kind of interesting is that the writer's style changes notably from classical to modern, at least in my own experience. So what do I mean by classical Japanese and modern Japanese? Before I even describe what's going on this slide, I want to emphasize something. If there's one thing you take away from this particular lesson, I want it to be this, that the Kyu Kanazukai that we looked at in the previous lesson and the complex kanji, that is not classical Japanese. It's just a different way to write the language. It is not classical Japanese. I cannot tell you how many students have learned about the Kyu Kanazukai, have learned complex kanji, and then have gone off happily and told their friends that they know classical Japanese, which is just wrong, okay? So that's the takeaway from this lesson. Let's return to this slide. On the right-hand side, we have the opening passage from The Tale of the Bamboo Cutter in classical. And on the left-hand side, we have that same passage in a modern, effectively a modern translation, a modern version. So that passage on the left, which reads vertically, top to bottom, right to left, if your Japanese is up to snuff, should look not too unfamiliar. Verbal endings, connections, all that stuff seems to be something that maybe you've seen before. On the right, you'll see some of the same kanji, but I'm willing to bet that the verbal endings don't look familiar. Now, of course, on the right we also have the Kyu Kanazukai, and on the left we have the new orthography, but don't let that distract you. Okay, what I really want to be looking at here is the grammar. So on the right-hand side, here we have a verb. Let me give myself a highlighter here. Ari keri. Ari keri. That keri, that's a verbal ending. Here it is again. It's not something that carries over into modern. One of the other things you'll probably notice about that right-hand side passage is it doesn't have any punctuation. And indeed, in classical Japanese, there is no punctuation. That is less of a hurdle than you might think, because in classical Japanese, many times the verbal ending will tell you where you are in a passage. There is a distinct sentence ending form that ceases really to exist in modern. So not having the punctuation isn't too much of a problem. I cheated a little bit on the right. I left in the voice consonant markers, but as I mentioned earlier, in most texts, we don't have those. You have to figure them out by context. And you'll also notice that on the right-hand side, that passage, although it's the same amount of material, it says the same thing, is significantly shorter than what we have on the left. One of the cool things, I think, about classical Japanese is that it had a much larger number of verbal inflections than modern Japanese does, so it was really easy to convey subtleties without extra words just by choosing the right verbal ending. So that's what we mean when we're talking about classical Japanese. There are, incidentally, remnants of classical Japanese in modern Japanese, and this is my effort to give you a little bit of a hook, maybe make you interested in someday studying classical Japanese. For example, you ever wonder why we say Ohayo? We don't say Hayai. We don't say Hayaku. We say Ohayo. That O and that same o in arigato, those are classical verbal endings or adjectival endings. Or something like yamu o ezu. If you don't know this expression, it means something that you can't help. Okay. What's that zu doing in there? That's also from classical. Or the expression omowazu, to do something without thinking. Omowazu itte shimatta, I went without thinking. That zu, again, same zu as we saw in yamu o ezu, comes from classical Japanese. So there's these little bits and pieces that have carried over into modern. If you ever find something unusual in modern Japanese, particularly if it's at the end of a verb or the end of an adjective and you wonder what's it doing there, chances are the answer is that it goes back to classical. Now, in order to understand what's going on in classical Japanese, it's good, I would suggest, to start with a verbal inflection chart, a doshi katsuyo hyo. I'm going to show you an example on a subsequent slide. But it's frankly, the example is going to be so small, be very hard for you to read. But I'm telling you, you can find one of these in just about any classical Japanese dictionary. Okay, that verbal chart is not just good for understanding classical Japanese, and this is why I'm really pushing the point. That chart, that verbal chart, also will help you understand modern Japanese and how modern Japanese is broken down by linguists, what those paradigms mean. Good Kokugo Jiten, modern Kokugo Jiten, we have a number of them in our library here at Albany, and I think in any library that's got a basic Kokugo Jiten, you'll find something like this. It's usually on the inside of the cover or in one of the appendices. We'll have a chart that compares modern and classical inflections. One of my favorites comes from the Kojien. That was one of the dictionaries we looked at in the online dictionary unit. And that's the one that I'm going to be showing you on the next couple slides. But before I get there, because when you see the next slides, you'll probably run away from your computer screaming, let me just say that the reason I wanted to emphasize this and bring it up, even though I wouldn't expect you to master it and I won't be testing you on it, is that I'm on a mission. I'm on a mission to convey to Japanese learners, people who are learning Japanese as a second language, how Japanese is thought of by native speakers, not how it's thought of by people who specifically teach it as a foreign language. In all the textbooks that I've ever seen of Japanese as a foreign language, it introduces the language, the verbs, for example, in category type 1 and type 2 verbs. Sometimes they're called u verbs or do verbs. But that's not how the Japanese think of their verbs. And very quickly you find there are sort of issues with those categories that are designed for foreigners. Moreover, if you get more advanced and you try and speak with your Japanese friends about grammar, they're not going to know those divisions. There's no concept like that, the type 1 or the type 2 verb for native speakers. So I find that problematic. I think that we should simply stick with what the Japanese have developed themselves of their language and go from there. Here's an example of a verbal inflection chart. The top part, the dividing line is right here. Okay. The top part is classical Japanese. Notice it says bungo here. The bottom part is modern Japanese, kogo, the vernacular. And it gives examples of how verbs inflect. Okay. Now, I could go on for another 15 minutes on this chart, but I think it's too detailed for the purposes of this course. I do want to show you the next chart. These are auxiliary verbs or verbal suffixes. You might think of them that way. Again, the bottom of the chart is modern Japanese and the top of the chart is classical Japanese. So if you look at the bottom of the chart, you'll see some endings that are really familiar. Nai, as in the negative. Ta, as in the past tense, simple. Dashi, as in something seems to be. Here we have da or des. Okay, those should all be really familiar to you. And get over here, we've got the causative and the passive and all that stuff, right? And then the corresponding endings in classical are above that. And I'm showing this chart in part to to illustrate what I was saying earlier, that classical Japanese is much more rich in its nuances. So here, down in this column where ta is, we've got one ending. But if we look up here, we see that there were 7 different ways to indicate the past tense in classical Japanese. And each one has its own little nuance and was used more in a particular period and all that kind of thing. So it's really kind of cool stuff. If you're interested in more details on that, shoot me an email and I will try and fill in the blanks. And with that, we are done with this particular learning module.